There was a watch his brother never came home to explain. It sat in a plastic bag among the last few things returned to Yeon-Woo after the search was called off. A small, ordinary object that should have meant nothing. And for a while, it did mean nothing. The search teams had long since given up. The official conclusion was simple. Yeon-Woo had disappeared somewhere no one could follow. Missing, presumed dead. That was the phrase they used. As if the word presumed could protect a family from what it actually meant. Yeon-Woo was not the kind of man who fell apart easily. Years in special forces had taken whatever softness he once had and ground it down to something harder and colder. He had survived things that broke other men. He knew how to contain grief the way you contain a wound. Pressure, silence, forward movement. He told himself the watch was nothing. He told himself he would get through it. Then the watch activated. And everything changed. What played from that small device was not a recording in any ordinary sense. It was his brother's voice. His brother's memory. An entire chronicle of a hidden world. A tower that existed somewhere beyond the edge of ordinary life. A place that swallowed people whole and turned them into something different on the other side. Yeon-Woo had found his way in. He had climbed, he had fought, he had built himself into something remarkable, and somewhere along the way, the people he trusted most had looked at what he carried and decided it was worth more than his life. Yeon-Woo listened to every second of it. He sat with his brother's voice in the quiet, and he listened to the story of a man who had entered a godlike tower, looking for a cure for their dying mother, who had clawed his way upward through monsters and madmen, who had found allies and made enemies, who had discovered something so valuable that powerful clans went to war over it, and who, in the end, had been betrayed by the one person he should never have had to question. By the time the recording stopped, the grief in Yeon-Woo had changed shape. It was not the kind of grief that weeps. It was the kind that calculates. He had a name. He had a trail. He had his brother's memories, his brother's knowledge of the tower, and now a cold, absolute purpose that would not bend and would not break. The brother who had gone in unprepared would not make that mistake. The brother who went in now had spent years learning how people destroyed each other, and he intended to use every single piece of that knowledge. The tower would not be ready for what was coming. Yeon-Woo sealed the watch, gathered what his brother had left him, and made a choice that no one watching from the outside could fully understand. He walked away from the life he had built. He left behind the career, the routines, the ordinary world that had continued existing while his brother was dying somewhere inside a place that shouldn't exist. There was nothing left in that world worth staying for, not anymore. His mother was already gone. His brother was already gone. All that remained was the accounting. Floor Zero appeared to him without ceremony. There was no dramatic gateway, no announcement, no formal welcome into the tower that had taken his brother's life. One moment he was in the world he knew. The next, he was somewhere else. A space that existed between ordinary reality and the tower proper. A threshold where new entrants were assessed, classified, and sent forward to begin. The system spoke to him in the flat, impersonal language of a machine that had processed thousands before him and would process thousands more. Stats, traits, abilities. A status window that laid out the raw measurements of what he currently was. He read every line of it carefully. The two traits that appeared were not what most new entrants received. Cold-blooded nature arrived first, a classification the system assigned to people whose minds functioned differently under pressure, who did not flood with panic when death was close, who could think through the noise that shut other people down. For most, crisis narrowed the mind to a single desperate point. For Yeon-Woo, it did the opposite. The more dangerous the situation, the clearer his thinking became. The system had recognized something in him that the military had spent years deliberately cultivating, and it had given that quality a name and a mechanical function. Dragon Eyes came second, and this one was stranger. The ability presented itself as a form of enhanced perception, not just sharper vision, but a deeper kind of analysis. When he looked at an opponent, the eyes could read the structure of their movement, map the pathways of their energy, identify the places where they were exposed. When he looked at a wall, they could find the seams where something hidden had been built in. When he looked at a dungeon, they could trace the shape of what wasn't visible yet. His brother had written about this ability. Yeon-Woo had understood what it meant when it appeared in someone. It meant the tower was offering that person a different kind of path. Yeon-Woo noted both traits, said nothing, and stepped forward into the tutorial. The tutorial was not what people who hadn't seen it imagined when they heard the word. Tutorials in ordinary games were gentle introductions, hand-holding exercises, safe spaces designed to teach without real consequence. This one was split across 7 sections, labeled A through G, and each block increased in difficulty, at a pace that killed a meaningful percentage of the people who tried to pass through. The early deaths happened fast. New entrants who entered floor 0 thinking the tower would ease them in gently did not survive long enough to learn otherwise. Yeon-Woo had his brother's records to rely on. Jung-Woo had documented everything. Every trap configuration, every hidden mechanic, every monster pattern, every shortcut that most people didn't know existed. He had left it all in the recordings, in careful detail, the way a man leaves a map for someone he hopes might come after him. It was a final act of love from a dead brother to a living one, and Yeon-Woo used it with a cold precision that would have made Jung-Woo proud. Block A was the proving ground. The traps here were designed to kill the careless and test the quick. For most entrants, the goal was simply to survive, to get through without dying, to reach the safe zone at the far end, and to count yourself fortunate for having made it. Yeon-Woo did not approach it that way. He already knew where the traps were placed. He already knew how the activation sequences worked. Rather than avoiding them, he began to deliberately trigger them from safe positions, using the mechanical danger they represented as a training device. Every dodge raised his agility. Every impact he took on purpose, absorbed at the edge of what his body could handle, pushed his endurance upward. The traps that were supposed to kill him became a curriculum, and he was an extremely attentive student. His stats climbed in ways that should not have been possible for someone who had just entered. The system registered his growth with the same impersonal accuracy it registered everything else, updating his numbers as if it didn't notice that what was happening was unusual. But it was unusual. Most entrants spent their first days in Block A simply trying not to die. Yeon-Woo spent them building a foundation that veterans who had been climbing for years would have found difficult to match. Then he met the merchant. The figure appeared in the safe zone between blocks, carrying the kind of relaxed expression that belongs to someone who has seen enough of the tower to stop being surprised by any of it. Merchants in the tower occupied a strange position, outside the ranking systems, outside the clan hierarchies, moving through the floors in a way that regular climbers couldn't easily replicate, trading in things that couldn't be found through ordinary means. This particular merchant had a specific set of goods, and one of them stopped Yeon-Woo cold when he saw it listed. Reset tickets. The concept was simple once he understood it. A reset ticket could be used to erase all the stat progress a player had accumulated and return them to baseline. Everything wiped clean, all growth undone, as if they had never entered the floor at all. For anyone who had spent weeks or months grinding those stats upward, using such a ticket would be an act of deliberate self-destruction. It was the kind of item that existed in the tower's economy primarily as a curiosity, something with obvious theoretical uses that almost no one was willing to pay the practical cost for. Yeon-Woo bought as many as he could carry. What he had understood, that the merchant seemed quietly impressed by, was the deeper logic of the reset system. The stats he gained on each run through the tutorial did not disappear entirely when he reset. There was a residual imprint, a permanent trace of what the body and mind had experienced that persisted even after the numbers were wiped. The reset removed the quantified gains but left behind something harder to measure and much harder to undo. He could run the tutorial again from 0, gain the same stats again, push through the same ceiling again, and every time he did, the underlying capacity grew. It was not efficient by ordinary standards. It required giving up progress that took real effort to achieve. But efficiency, in this case, was the wrong framework. He was not trying to climb quickly. He was trying to build something that nothing in the tower could stop. He ran the tutorial multiple times. Each cycle took him through the same blocks, the same traps, the same monster encounters, the same hidden corners his brother had marked in the recordings. Each cycle ended with a reset, a return to 0, and then another run. The numbers told the story in plain terms. By the time he finished, stats that should have taken a climber months or years of ordinary grinding were sitting at levels that didn't make sense for someone who had just arrived. The other entrants in the tutorial didn't know what to make of him. The few who paid attention noticed that his numbers seemed wrong. Too high for where he was in the progression. Too developed for someone nobody had heard of before. They noted it and moved on, because the tutorial was dangerous enough that sustained attention to other people's status windows was a luxury most couldn't afford. Yeon-Woo did not explain himself to anyone. Block A eventually gave way to Block B, and Block B brought new variables. The monsters here were different, not just traps and environmental hazards, but creatures that moved and reacted and had to be read. His dragon eyes proved their value immediately. What other climbers saw when they looked at a monster was an opponent with health, with attack patterns, with a set of surface behaviors that had to be learned through repeated painful contact. What Yeon-Woo saw was a map. The eyes traced the flows of energy through a creature's body, highlighted the points where that energy concentrated before an attack, showed him the gaps in its structure that ordinary observation would take much longer to find. He was not fighting blind. He was fighting with information no one else around him had access to. He did not yet know the full scope of what the dragon eyes could eventually show him. His brother's records mentioned that the ability evolved, that what it revealed in the early floors was only the first layer of a much deeper perception that would unfold as he climbed. He filed that detail away the way he filed everything, carefully, without sentimentality, in the part of his mind that was building the long plan. It was in Block B that he first encountered Yule. She was not hard to find, because she wasn't hiding, she was simply left. Her former teammates had used her as bait. It was a clean, efficient betrayal in the tutorial's brutal economy. She had been useful to them until she wasn't, and then she had become a tool for drawing in a dungeon creature that they didn't want to deal with directly. They had positioned her, walked away, and didn't look back. The creature was already circling when Yeon-Woo arrived. He killed the creature. He told Yule what had happened, plainly, without attempting to soften it. She already knew what her teammates had done, had known it the moment she understood their positioning. What she needed from him was not comfort, she needed to not be dead, and he had handled that part. She looked at him for a long moment after he explained. Then she asked what he wanted in return. He told her he wanted nothing. It was not a kindness, not entirely. It was simply that she had nothing he required, and transactional debts with someone in her position were more trouble than they were worth. What he didn't say, because he didn't say things like this, was that he had seen his brother's records from inside. He had seen what betrayal did to people in the tower when there was no one present to stop it. He was not going to stand there and watch it happen when he had the means to intervene. She joined him anyway, not because he asked, because there was nowhere else logical to go, and because she understood, even at this early stage, that she was safer near him than away from him. The hidden dungeon appeared on his brother's map at a junction most entrants walked past without looking twice. It was not marked on any of the official tutorial documentation. The door that led to it was built into a wall that presented, to ordinary inspection, as solid stone. But the dragon eyes saw the seam, traced the outline of what was behind it, and showed him the lock mechanism that had been designed to look like weathering in the rock. He opened it without ceremony and went in. The dungeon inside was operating on a different difficulty scale than the blocks outside. The monsters here were not tutorial grade. They were creatures that should not have existed at this depth of the tower. Specimens that felt like they had been placed here by someone who understood that a very specific kind of climber would eventually find the door. Creatures that did not negotiate and did not hesitate and would kill him without pause if he gave them anything less than his full capability. He gave them everything he had. The fights were not clean. Several of them were genuinely dangerous in a way the tutorial's main path had not quite been, even accounting for his unusual preparation. He burned through his stamina faster than he liked. He took hits that tested the endurance he had built across his reset cycles. There were moments where a slightly different outcome would have meant the end of everything, where the cold calculation had to work faster than it had ever worked before, where the dragon eyes had to read the next 3 seconds of a creature's attack pattern and find the solution before the first second finished playing out. He found the solution each time. At the back of the dungeon, behind the largest and most aggressive of the creatures inside, he found what his brother's records had flagged. A dagger built into a weapon rack that looked like it belonged to an earlier era of the tower. Something old enough that the stone around it had grown over the hilt. It came free in his hand with a resistance that felt deliberate, like the weapon was assessing who was taking it. The moment his grip closed fully around it, something passed between the artifact and the person holding it. A recognition, a transfer of property that the tower's system registered with a notification that appeared quietly at the edge of his vision. The dagger was not a cutting tool in any ordinary sense. Its function was consumption. When it drew blood from an enemy, it did not stop at the wound. It pulled. Vitality, energy, something that the tower classified in categories he was still learning to read. It drained, and what it drained transferred to its wielder. He felt it the first time he tested it on one of the remaining dungeon creatures, a warmth that moved through his hand and up his arm, a sensation of something being added that had not been there before. Power. In the most literal sense, the tower understood that word. He stood in the empty dungeon and looked at the weapon for a long time. His brother had known it was here. His brother had left him the map to find it. Yeon-Woo had understood what it would do in the right hands, and he had made sure those hands would know where to look. It was another piece of the inheritance. Not money, not property, not the ordinary things a brother might leave behind, but tools, advantages. Everything Yeon-Woo had discovered in his time inside the tower, organized and preserved, and waiting for the person who would use them properly. Yeon-Woo consumed the remaining materials in the dungeon before leaving. Some of the creatures had carried things his brother's records had flagged as useful for physical development, substances that interacted with his body's current trajectory in ways that accelerated the transformation the tower seemed to have already begun. He did not know the full shape of where that transformation was heading. His brother's records described it in pieces, with the careful uncertainty of someone documenting a process he was still living through when he wrote the notes. What Yeon-Woo knew was the direction, and the direction was clear enough. He left the dungeon different from how he had entered it. The safe zone between blocks held a population of climbers doing what people did when they weren't actively fighting, resting, trading, assessing each other from careful distances, forming alliances of convenience that everyone understood might not survive past the next dangerous section. It was in one of these spaces that he first crossed paths with Khan and Doyle. They were not hiding from each other, which was already unusual. Most alliances in the tutorial were quiet, slightly wary things, partnerships of mutual necessity, where neither party was entirely sure the other wouldn't make a different calculation the moment circumstances changed. Khan and Doyle moved like people who had decided to trust each other and were done second-guessing it. Khan was the tactical one, reading the room with the flat attention of someone who had learned, somewhere before the tower, that the difference between life and death was often just information gathered early. Doyle was warmer on the surface, carrying the kind of easy manner that made people think he was less serious than he was. He was very serious. He just didn't find it necessary to advertise the fact. They looked at Yeon-Woo with the same careful assessment he was applying to them. What he saw when he looked at them was straightforward. Two high-ranking climbers with real capability, complementary styles, and no obvious agenda against him. His brother's records hadn't mentioned them by name, which meant they were either newer than Yeon-Woo's time in the tutorial, or had operated in sections Yeon-Woo hadn't mapped. Either way, they represented assets rather than threats, and Yeon-Woo was not so committed to operating alone that he would refuse useful assets out of pride. He proposed a temporary alliance. Khan asked what he was planning. Yeon-Woo told him. Not everything. He never told anyone everything, but enough to make clear that he had a specific objective in the next block, and that having two capable fighters alongside him would increase the probability of achieving it while keeping all three of them alive. It was not an emotional argument. It was a probability argument, and Khan, being the kind of person who thought in those terms, responded to it correctly. They went in together. The Lizard King territory was one of the sections his brother had flagged as a location that most tutorial climbers avoided or lost people in. The creatures that ruled it came in a coordinated pair, a dynamic that most hunters failed to account for, engaging one while the second watched their flank and waited for the moment of maximum exposure. The combination had killed a significant number of people who should have been strong enough to handle either one individually. Yeon-Woo had read the records. He knew the pattern. He used Khan and Doyle as a complementary set of variables in a problem he had already mostly solved before they entered the territory, assigning positioning and timing with the flat authority of someone who has run the calculation and knows the answer. Khan adapted without needing to be told twice. Doyle executed with the cheerful efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed the work. The Lizard King pair fell. In the aftermath, they found a group of prisoners the creatures had been holding, climbers who had been taken during hunts, kept alive for reasons that the tutorial's internal logic made darkly clear once you understood what some of the higher-tier monsters did with living captives. Yeon-Woo freed them with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he applied to everything. He did not linger. He did not make speeches. He found the lock mechanisms and he opened them, and he told the surviving prisoners which direction led out. Among the loot from the Lizard King territory was the Aragon crown, an artifact his brother had listed as something worth going out of the way to obtain. He took it without ceremony and moved forward. The alliance with Khan and Doyle did not dissolve after the mission. It was the kind of partnership that self-reinforces once it proves it works, each successful collaboration making the cost of separating slightly higher than the cost of continuing. They were not sentimental about it. None of the three were particularly sentimental people, but they were competent, and they recognized competence in each other, and in the tower, that was its own form of bond. What was coming next, Yeon-Woo knew from the records, was darker. The token thefts he had started noticing were not random. The pattern his brother had documented pointed towards something organized, something that operated at a scale that individual criminals in the tutorial couldn't maintain on their own. Someone was running an operation. The tokens being taken were currency, karma, the tower's primary exchange medium, the thing you needed to buy advantages and rare items and information. Stealing it systematically required infrastructure. Infrastructure required backing. Backing, in the tower, meant clans. He followed the trail. What he found at the end of it was not something he had fully prepared himself for emotionally, despite understanding intellectually that the tower contained people willing to do terrible things for advantage. The human farms were organized spaces where climbers had been taken, stripped of their autonomy, and turned into resources. Their karma was harvested. Their bodies were used in experiments that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the kind of cold institutional cruelty that powerful organizations develop when they stop being accountable to anything outside themselves. He stood at the edge of the first site he found and looked at it for a moment. The coldness that defined him was still there, but underneath it, in a place he rarely acknowledged, something burned. His brother had known about this. The records touched on it. Yeon-Woo had found evidence of these operations during his own climb and had understood immediately that they were connected to the clan networks that controlled large sections of the tower's economy. The 8 great clans were not abstract villains in a story. They were specific organizations with specific people at their heads who had made specific decisions to allow this, to fund it, to benefit from it. Yeon-Woo had gathered evidence. He had tried to do something about it, and the people who benefited from what he was gathering evidence against had found a way to ensure he could never use it. Yeon-Woo looked at the farm and made a list. He did not write it down. He did not need to. The list existed in the same cold, precise interior space where all his plans lived, detailed, complete, and patient. He began taking down the scavenger groups that ran the farms one by one. He was not loud about it. He did not announce himself or issue warnings or give anyone the opportunity to prepare. He appeared, destroyed the operation, and moved to the next location on the list that his brother's records had given him. The people who ran these places were not weak. They had survived long enough in the tower to have real capabilities, to have backup systems, to have numbers on their side. Against someone who knew where they were, who understood their methods, who had prepared for their specific configurations in advance, those advantages meant very little. Word began to spread, in the quiet channels the tower's underground used to communicate, that someone was systematically taking apart the infrastructure. The Blue Sword connection became clearer as he moved deeper. There was an organization above the scavenger level that was coordinating the farms, and that organization had ties to the clan hierarchy in ways that ran higher than the tutorial leadership anyone could see directly. He kept moving. The Akasha Serpent was something his brother had marked as a hunt worth attempting if the opportunity arose. A creature of significant scale and power that occupied a specific territory in one of the tutorial's deeper hidden zones. The rewards for killing it were on a different tier from what most tutorial monsters offered. His brother had attempted it during his own climb and had not fully succeeded before other circumstances interrupted. Yeon-Woo trained first. He found Galliard in a section of the tutorial that most people moved through without stopping. The Dark Elf Master was not interested in teaching new arrivals as a rule. He was interested in teaching people who could actually use what he knew, and Yeon-Woo, who stood in front of him and said almost nothing and let his status window speak for itself, was the first in some time who met that threshold. Galliard looked at the numbers and looked at the person and made a decision. The fleeting steps technique was not a combat skill in the ordinary sense. It was a movement system, a way of positioning and repositioning in three-dimensional space that removed the predictability from a fighter's footwork and made targeting them a fundamentally different problem than targeting someone who moved in normal patterns. Against opponents who relied on reading movement, and in the tower, most high-level opponents did exactly that. The technique turned engagements into something that went badly for the other side faster than they expected. He practiced until Galliard was satisfied, then went to find the serpent. What he found instead was its corpse. Someone had gotten there first. The Akasha serpent, which should have been occupying its territory and defending it with the casual, overwhelming force of a creature that had existed in that space long enough to believe itself unchallenged, was dead on the floor of its lair. The kills had not been clean. Something about the method looked deliberate in a different sense than ordinary hunting. The serpent had been killed in a way that preserved specific organs, suggesting that whoever had done this was not simply hunting, but was operating according to a different plan entirely. He found the evidence of what that plan was shortly after. Resurrection rituals in the tower existed in a category of advanced knowledge that most climbers didn't have access to, and wouldn't have known how to use if they did. The ritual his brother's records had flagged, the one that was apparently now being activated in the Akasha serpent's territory, was designed to bring the creature back in a modified state. Not as it had been, but as something shaped by whatever material and intent had been woven into the resurrection process. The serpent that came back would be stronger than the original, more dangerous, and under certain interpretations of tower law, the people who had resurrected it would have a claim of ownership over it. Yeon-Woo did not let that happen. What he did instead was harder to describe than simply fighting. He located the factions of creatures in the area that had existing conflicts with each other, territorial disputes, resource competitions, historical antagonisms that the tutorial's ecosystem had allowed to persist because they served some balancing function. He introduced information into those conflicts. He created conditions that pushed the factions from passive hostility into active war with each other, using the serpent's territory as the battleground where those conflicts would naturally converge. The battle that resulted was not clean. It was enormous and chaotic and extraordinarily violent, and in the middle of it, the resurrecting serpent finished coming back. It arrived into a war zone and began doing what the Akasha serpent did in war zones, feeding on the violence, consuming the dead, growing stronger with each moment the chaos continued. The people who had planned to own it lost control of the situation almost immediately. The situation had been designed, with considerable precision, to go out of control. Yeon-Woo waited until the serpent had fed enough to be substantially larger than its original form. Then he killed it. The core he devoured afterward landed in his system like a detonation. The physical change was immediate and dramatic enough that the tower's system registered it with a cascade of notifications that he processed in the quiet aftermath of the battle. His body was different. The dragon body evolution that had been quietly progressing since he entered the tower had reached a new stage, and the stage it had reached was not subtle about what it was. More capacity, more strength, a physical architecture that had begun to diverge from what human beings normally were. He did not stop to consider what that meant for his long-term humanity. That was a question for later. There was too much remaining on the list. The intelligence on Arundel had been building piece by piece since the early blocks. Arundel was the tutorial's primary faction leader in certain territories, visible, powerful, connected to enough of the legitimate ranking infrastructure that his other activities remained comfortably invisible to most people who passed through. The human farms were his. The experiments were his. The network that had been harvesting karma and lives with industrial efficiency operated because he ran it and because he had backing from people who were higher in the tower's power structure than he was. Yeon-Woo hit the base directly. He had the location from his brother's records. He had the layout from the intelligence he had gathered during the farm takedowns. He had the timing from watching the base's operational patterns long enough to identify the windows where its defenses were thinnest. He had Khan and Doyle, who had been briefed on the mission in the flat, factual terms he used for everything, and who had responded with the same practical readiness they brought to everything. The assault was not a battle, it was a dissection. Each element of the defense was taken apart in the sequence that minimized loss and maximized confusion on the other side. The people inside the base who tried to fight back found that the information they needed to mount an effective response, where the attackers were, how many there were, what their approach would be, was consistently wrong, because Yeon-Woo had been one step ahead of their defensive planning since before the attack began. Khan and Doyle, who had been held inside, were found in the facility's lower levels. He freed them the same way he freed the farm prisoners, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency, the same absence of ceremony. But Khan, looking at him in the moment of being freed, said something that Yeon-Woo filed away and didn't respond to directly. He said that whatever was driving this had better be worth it. Yeon-Woo told him it was. He left it at that. The human farm inside the base was larger than the external sites he had already destroyed. It had been running longer. The scope of it, when he moved through it systematically and documented what he found, confirmed that the organization behind the farms was not a minor player in the tutorial's underground economy. It was a major one, with connections that ran upward through layers of management into the clan hierarchies that controlled the tower's upper floors. The records here contained more information about his brother's murder than he had been able to find anywhere else. Specific names, specific decisions, a chain of accountability that he traced from the bottom level all the way up to a set of organizations he had been working toward since the recordings in the watch first played. He obtained what he needed. He destroyed what he found. He killed the key people in the base who were directly responsible for what he had uncovered. Before leaving, he found a stone in the deepest section of the facility. His brother's records mentioned it in a passage that was less clear than most of Jung-Woo's documentation. A note that flagged the stone as significant without fully explaining why, written in the tone of someone who had found it too late to properly investigate it. Yeon-Woo took it. He would understand it later. He was good at later. Block G was the last section of the tutorial, and reaching it with the intent to compete for rankings was a different thing from simply surviving through it. The rankings were determined by a combination of karma accumulated, tokens collected, combat accomplishments, and the various achievement flags that the tutorial scattered through its trials like breadcrumbs for the people motivated to find them. The top-ranked players in the tutorial at this stage were not beginners who had gotten lucky. They were serious competitors who had spent significant time in the tower's preliminary systems, who had formed alliances and strategies and built genuine capability. Adora held first place. She had held it for long enough that the other high-ranked players had stopped seriously contesting it, not because they had given up, but because they had concluded that the gap between her and them was large enough to make it not worth the cost of trying to close it. She was not simply powerful, she had predictive capability, an ability to see angles of a situation before they developed that made fighting her feel like fighting someone who already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for events to catch up to her knowledge. Her brother Fante held second. He was a different kind of threat, no particular interest in predictions or strategies, just genuine enthusiasm for fighting people who were good enough to make the fight meaningful. They were, between them, a significant problem for anyone who wanted first place. Yeon-Woo did not try to fight his way to first place. He understood Adora well enough from his brother's records to know that direct combat, on terms she had time to prepare for, was not the approach most likely to succeed. What he needed was to control the conditions, to create a situation where the advantages her ability gave her couldn't fully compensate for the variables he introduced. What he did was faster to experience than to explain. He moved through Block G with a speed and efficiency that the other high-ranked players couldn't match, not because his raw power was necessarily greater than theirs at every point, but because he knew where everything was, every hidden piece his brother had marked, every token cache, every achievement flag that rewarded completion of conditions that most people never identified. He collected them with systematic thoroughness while the other competitors were still operating on the information available to people who hadn't spent years preparing specifically for this moment. He fought Fante. That part was unavoidable. Fante was not the kind of person who would let someone climb through the rankings without testing them, and he was not the kind of person Yeon-Woo could simply go around. The fight was not clean. Fante was as good as the record suggested, maybe slightly better, operating with the comfortable aggression of someone who enjoyed fighting and had done enough of it to be genuinely excellent at the parts that enjoyment sharpens. Yeon-Woo used fleeting steps in ways Galliard's training had made available, and his dragon eyes in ways the tutorial hadn't prepared Fante to account for, and eventually found the sequence that ended it. Adora watched the sequence from outside the engagement, and what her expression showed, the rare, involuntary reaction that broke through the control she usually maintained, told him that he had surprised her, that her ability had not predicted this outcome. It was a small thing, that surprise, but it mattered. It meant the gap between what she could see coming and what he could do was narrower than she was used to working with. The karma count at the close of the tutorial finals put him in first place. The margin was not enormous. It didn't need to be. First place was first place, and the Zeus Key that came with it, A rare reward that would open something in the tower proper that had not been accessible through ordinary means, was exactly what his brother's records had told him to look for. He took it and said nothing about it to anyone. What the tutorial had done to him, the process that had begun in Block A with a man arriving in a state of barely controlled grief, armed only with a dead man's memories, was not subtle in its results. He was not what he had been when he entered. The stats were different. The evolution was different. The weapon he carried, the techniques he had mastered, the allies he had forged into something durable by the pressure of shared survival, all of it was different. The tower had taken the raw material of what the special forces had built and had continued the project, and the project had moved in a direction that even the people who built him would not have fully anticipated. He stepped through the threshold between the tutorial and the tower proper, carrying first place, the Zeus Key, the vampiric dagger, the Aragon crown, a growing understanding of the dragon body his brother had described, and a list of names that had not gotten shorter. The true tower opened in front of him. It was not welcoming and it was not hostile. It simply existed, enormous, ancient, structured in ways that the tutorial had only been a small, controlled introduction to, filled with people who had been climbing for years, and with organizations that had been accumulating power for decades. Somewhere above him, in floors he had not yet reached, were the people at the top of the chain he had begun pulling apart in the tutorial. The 8 great clans, whose backing had made Arendon's operation possible, whose involvement in his brother's murder ran deeper than what he had uncovered so far, whose reach extended through the tower in ways he was still mapping. He found Hanova without difficulty. The blacksmith's location was another piece of his brother's legacy. Yeon-Woo had written about Hanova the way he wrote about very few people, with a warmth that the normally precise records didn't often show. Hanova had been his friend, his teacher in certain technical disciplines, one of the handful of people in the tower that Yeon-Woo had trusted completely. When Yeon-Woo arrived at the forge and introduced himself, Hanova looked at his face and went very still for a moment. The resemblance to Yeon-Woo was, according to the records, striking. Yeon-Woo had been told this before. He had always found the information neither useful nor painful, simply a fact about what he was. But watching Hanova's face process the encounter, the grief and the recognition and the complicated thing that happened when someone who has lost a person they loved finds an echo of that person standing in front of them, he understood, in the particular way he understood things, that this relationship mattered. He did not say anything about what he was planning. He asked about Yeon-Woo. He let Hanova talk. He listened, and filed what he heard alongside everything else he was building, and understood that this man was loyal to his brother's memory in a way that made him worth protecting. He would need to protect him. The factions connected to the 8 clans had not missed his performance in the tutorial. A masked newcomer who demolished the human farm network, kills the Akasha serpent in the middle of a manufactured war, takes first place in the rankings from Adora, and walks out with the Zeus Key. That kind of performance does not pass unnoticed among the organizations that track what happens in the lower floors. They did not know yet who he was. They knew what he had done, and what he had done was enough to make him someone they needed to assess. The first signs of that attention arrived quickly, people asking questions in the wrong places. Figures appearing near Hanova's forge with the kind of casual proximity that wasn't casual. The infrastructure of surveillance that powerful organizations deploy when they want to understand something without announcing their interest in it. Yeon-Woo watched all of it and said nothing. He was used to being underestimated. He had spent his entire time in the tutorial being underestimated. The unknown newcomer, the nobody, the masked figure who kept appearing in places he shouldn't have been capable of reaching. They had looked at what they could measure, and they had judged him by those measurements, and the measurements had not been sufficient to contain what he actually was. The organizations now watching him were making a version of the same mistake. They saw someone who had performed well in the tutorial. They did not yet see someone who had been planning, from the moment a watch activated in a cold room, to take apart everything they had built. He would let them continue not seeing it, for a while. The time for clarity would come later. There was something Hanova needed to say before he could say anything else. He had been a blacksmith in the tower long enough to have stopped expecting people to surprise him. The floors had a way of cycling through the same types: the ambitious, the desperate, the calculating, the ones who arrived certain they would reach the top, and the ones who knew, even as they entered, that they were simply buying time before something killed them. He had met thousands of climbers across his years at the forge, and had formed real bonds with very few of them. Yeon-Woo had been one of the few. He told Yeon-Woo about the first time the brother had arrived at his shop. Most climbers who came to a blacksmith in the tower's lower sections came because they needed something repaired or upgraded. A practical transaction. Brief, impersonal. The kind of exchange that left no particular impression on either side. Yeon-Woo had come in carrying a piece of ore that Hanova had not seen in years. A material that did not come from ordinary monster drops and that most climbers at Yeon-Woo's stage of progression had no business possessing. He had set it on the counter and asked, without preamble, what could be made from it. Hanova had looked at the ore for a long time. Then he had looked at the person who had brought it. Then he had asked where it came from. Yeon-Woo had told him the truth. That was the first unusual thing. Climbers rarely told blacksmiths the truth about where they obtained unusual materials, because the stories were usually complicated and occasionally incriminating, and most transactions went faster without them. Yeon-Woo had laid out the full account of where the ore had come from, what it had cost him to get there, and what he was trying to build. Hanova had listened, and at the end of the account, he had made a decision that he told Yeon-Woo he had never second-guessed. He would help. That first commission had become a conversation, and the conversation had extended across multiple visits, and somewhere in the accumulation of those visits, Hanova had stopped thinking of Yeon-Woo as a client and started thinking of him as something closer to a younger brother. The tower did not often produce friendships of the kind that actually mattered. The one that had formed between the old blacksmith and the young climber was the kind that mattered. Yeon-Woo listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer emotional responses of his own. He simply received the account and added it to everything he was building, not as data, not entirely, but as something he understood was significant in a way that went beyond tactical value. His brother had been loved here. That was not a small thing. Hanova eventually stopped talking and looked at him directly. He said that he could see his brother in the way Yeon-Woo held himself. Not the face alone, the posture, the stillness, the way his attention operated, as if every conversation was a problem being solved rather than an exchange being had. He said that Yeon-Woo had carried the same quality. He said it was both comforting and unsettling to be on the receiving end of it again. Yeon-Woo told him that he needed help understanding something from his brother's records. A notation about a specific alloy combination that the records described, but did not fully explain. He said it carefully, framing it as a technical question, which it partly was. What he did not say was that the alloy in question was one his brother had been developing in the period immediately before his murder, and that understanding its properties might tell him more about what Yeon-Woo had been building toward in his final days in the tower. Hanova recognized the alloy notation immediately. His face did something complicated. He said that Yeon-Woo had come to him about that exact material less than a month before he disappeared. He said the questions Yeon-Woo had asked about it were unusual. Not the questions of someone building a weapon for combat, but the questions of someone trying to understand what a particular artifact was made from and how it had been constructed. As if he had found something and was trying to reverse engineer its origin. Yeon-Woo asked what kind of artifact would use that alloy, Hanova told him. It was a category of item that the 8 great clans had historically controlled the production of, not because the materials required were rare in the abstract, but because the techniques for combining them correctly had been classified as clan proprietary knowledge and aggressively protected. Independent smiths who had figured out the process had a history of ending their careers abruptly, in ways that were documented in the tower's unofficial records as accidents, but that read in aggregate as something more deliberate. He let that information settle. Then he told Hanova he intended to stay in the tower's lower sections for a period. He would need equipment, he would pay, fairly, and he was prepared to pay in materials that weren't available through ordinary channels. He wanted to know if Hanova was willing to work with him. Hanova said yes without hesitating. The days that followed were quieter than what had come before, and Yeon-Woo recognized the quiet for what it was. Not absence of threat, but the particular stillness that precedes a different kind of danger. The tutorial had operated on the tower's economy at a relatively contained scale. What existed above it, the real tower, the actual floors, the systems where the 8 great clans exercised genuine power, was something else entirely. The rules there were both more formal and more lawless simultaneously. More formal because the clans maintained structures and hierarchies and codes of conduct that provided the appearance of order. More lawless because the gap between the appearance of order and the reality of what was done within that order was wide enough to swallow entire families. He spent part of his time in the lower tower, continuing the physical preparation his body required. The dragon body evolution that had advanced during the Akasha serpent fight was not finished with him. It moved in increments, each one accompanied by a period of integration where his system processed what had changed and recalibrated around it. He pushed those periods along by doing what he had always done, training into the edge of what he could currently handle, finding the thresholds, and systematically pushing past them. Khan and Doyle were present for most of this, in the way that people settle into proximity when they have decided, without necessarily making a formal announcement, that they are no longer simply temporarily allied, but are actually committed to the same direction. Khan had been absorbing information about the tower's political landscape with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that power in the upper floors was primarily information-based, who knew what, who owed what to whom, which alliances were genuine, and which were tactical performances. He shared what he found with Yeon-Woo in the same flat, direct way that Yeon-Woo shared things with him. No embellishment, no maneuvering, just the raw picture. Doyle's contribution was different in texture and equally valuable in practice. He moved through the social landscape of the tower's lower sections with an ease that neither Yeon-Woo nor Khan possessed, able to sit down with strangers and within a short conversation know what they wanted, what they feared, and what they were willing to say that they hadn't intended to. Information surfaced around Doyle without people realizing they had handed it over. He was good at the performance of being less formidable than he was, which was its own kind of tactical skill. Between the three of them, a picture of the immediate threat environment assembled itself over the course of several days. The organization that had been most directly watching them since their arrival in the tower proper was connected to the Blue Sword group he had traced back in the tutorial. Not the same leadership, that layer had been removed during the Arandan assault, but an upper tier that had insulated itself from the tutorial operations precisely so that when those operations were dismantled, the insulation would hold. They had watched Arandan's network fall from a comfortable distance and had drawn the logical conclusion that whoever was responsible for dismantling it was either a rival criminal organization or an independent actor with very specific knowledge of how the operation worked. They had not yet concluded that the person responsible was a newcomer to the tower who had arrived with a dead man's diary and a specific list of targets. That conclusion would take them longer to reach. Yeon-Woo intended to use the window before they reached it. Hanova delivered the first commissioned piece ahead of schedule. The weapon was not what casual observers would have identified as anything particularly notable. It was the kind of item that read, at first glance, as competent work from a skilled smith, without announcing itself as something more. That was deliberate. Hanova had incorporated the alloy combination at Yeon-Woo's request, and the combination had done what his brother's records suggested it would. The weapon interacted with the dragon body's current stage in a way that standard materials didn't. It extended the reach of what his physical capabilities could do, channeling energy in a pattern that complemented, rather than merely added to what was already there. He tested it in one of the tower's lower dungeon spaces, working through the movement patterns Galliard had taught him against opponents that the lower floors provided in useful variety. The fleeting steps and the new weapon resolved into something that operated as a unified system, the unpredictability of the movement feeding directly into the reach and energy channeling of what he carried. He watched the two things combine in practice and understood that his brother had been building toward exactly this configuration when he was stopped. It was a thought he did not linger on. The first real confrontation with a tower-level organized force came not as a frontal attack, but as an approach. 3 figures arrived near Hanova's forge one morning, carrying the kind of relaxed authority that belongs to people who represent something larger than themselves. They were not positioned as threats on the surface. They were positioned as visitors with a proposal, which was the standard opening move of organizations that preferred to absorb useful people rather than eliminate them when elimination wasn't yet necessary. They spoke with Hanova first, which told Yeon-Woo what he needed to know about who they thought was the significant party in the relationship. They were aware of the forge's output, had obtained a sample of the recent work, and wanted to know who the new client was and what the client's intentions were in the tower. Hanova told them he ran a private shop and that his client list was not a subject he discussed with parties who arrived without an invitation. This was not the answer they had anticipated. The dynamic of the interaction shifted slightly, not into open hostility, but into the kind of recalibration that happens when an approach based on assumed leverage encounters resistance before the leverage has been established. Yeon-Woo watched the exchange from a distance that allowed observation without participation. He was cataloging the three figures, their movement patterns, the weight of the equipment they carried, the way their attention distributed itself across the space, which one was making the decisions, and which ones were providing the appearance of backing. He was reading the interaction the way his military training had taught him to read situations before entering them. The dragon eyes added detail that the military training didn't provide on its own. The flow of energy through each of the three figures was visible to him in the way a diagram is visible when you know how to read the notation. One of them was significantly stronger than the other two, a gap that the physical presentation didn't advertise. The strongest one was also the quietest one, standing slightly back, apparently deferring to the figure doing the talking. It was a common arrangement: put the voice forward, keep the real capability in reserve, so that anyone assessing the group by the person who seems to be leading it will underestimate what's actually present. Yeon-Woo noted the arrangement and adjusted his assessment accordingly. The visitors eventually left without the information they had come for. They were not yet at the stage where they were willing to take what they wanted by force. Not here, not publicly, not from a blacksmith whose standing in this section of the tower provided a degree of social protection that made open confrontation costly. They would return with either more authority or more numbers, and they would not make the same assumptions about the forge's leverage position the second time. He told Hanova what he had observed after they left. He told him the timeline, as best he could estimate it, before those visitors came back with a different approach. He told him what the different approach would likely look like and what the response to it should be. He did not tell Hanova to leave. That was a decision that belonged to Hanova, who understood the tower's social architecture in ways that a new arrival didn't fully grasp, and who had maintained his position in this section through dynamics that went deeper than whatever Yeon-Woo's current involvement might suggest. Hanova listened to all of it. He said that he had been in the tower long enough to know what it looked like when a storm was coming, and that this felt like a storm. Yeon-Woo agreed. He said that he was not going to remove himself from the forge's vicinity before the storm arrived. He said it without elaborating, and Hanova, who by this point understood something about how Yeon-Woo's commitments worked, asked no further questions. The secondary intelligence that Khan had assembled in the days following the visitor's departure contained a detail that shifted the priority ordering of Yeon-Woo's plans. The upper-tier organization that had been watching them was not simply the Blue Sword's surviving leadership. It was a subsidiary operation of one of the 8 great clans. Not the most powerful of the 8, but a genuine member of the category. The connection to his brother's murder, which he had traced through Arendon's records to an organization above the tutorial level, ran through this particular clan's lower management. He now had a thread that connected directly to the people responsible. It did not lead all the way to the top, not yet. The chain between what he could currently verify and the actual decision-makers was long, with layers he hadn't penetrated. But it was a thread, and he had a history of following threads to places people expected to be unreachable. He went back to the watch recordings that night. He had been through them many times, but he approached each review with the understanding that what he could extract from them changed as his knowledge of the tower expanded. Details that had been abstract references on first listening became concrete and locatable with each passing week of his actual experience inside the tower. He looked now for the specific passages where his brother had described the individuals present during the final confrontation, the people who had been there when the elixir changed hands, and when the decision was made that Jung-Woo would not survive to protest it. There were names he could now match to the organizational structure Khan had assembled. Not all of them, but enough to begin moving with more precision than he had been able to manage while working from incomplete information. He prepared differently after that. The equipment Hanova had produced was good, but was oriented toward what the tutorial had required. The tower proper demanded adjustments. He reviewed what his brother's records said about the skill development arc that corresponded to his current stage of dragon body evolution. What abilities should be emerging, what training would accelerate their development, what the ceiling of the current stage looked like before the next transition would be available. The cold-blooded nature had begun doing something it hadn't done in the tutorial. In the tutorial, its function had been primarily psychological, the suppression of panic, the maintenance of clear analytical thinking under pressure. In the tower proper, with the dragon body at a more advanced stage of development, the nature was beginning to interact with his physical system in ways that went further. The calm it maintained was extending from his mind into his body's threat response, reducing the physiological signals that telegraphed his next action to opponents who were trained to read physical cues. He was becoming harder to predict not just intellectually but physically, in a way that the fleeting steps technique complemented and amplified. He noticed this during a training session with a tower climber he had been using as a sparring partner, an experienced fighter several floors above his current registration who had agreed to the sessions in exchange for access to Hanova's metalworking. The fighter was skilled enough to have been reading Yeon-Woo's movements accurately in their first few sessions. By the fifth session, the fighter mentioned, with the puzzled tone of someone naming a problem they can identify but not explain, that it was becoming genuinely difficult to anticipate anything. That fighting him felt like fighting someone who had decided to stop having tells. Yeon-Woo filed the observation away as confirmation of something useful. The second approach from the clan-connected organization was not through the same three figures. It came instead through an intermediary, a tower merchant of the legitimate variety who arrived at the forge with an apparently unrelated transaction and whose secondary agenda became clear quickly enough to Yeon-Woo, watching from nearby, that he had understood the purpose of the visit before the merchant had spoken more than a few sentences. The message being delivered, wrapped in the language of a business proposal, was that a certain party was interested in meeting with the forge's current primary client. The meeting was framed as an opportunity, a chance to discuss mutual interests, potential alliance, the kind of arrangement that powerful organizations extend to people who have demonstrated capability and who might be more useful absorbed than opposed. He sent back a message through the same intermediary. He said he was available at a time of his choosing, at a location of his choosing, and that the party who wished to meet him should arrive with principals rather than intermediaries if the conversation was to be worth anyone's time. The response that came back suggested that the party had found this reply either amusing or concerning, possibly both. They agreed to the conditions. The meeting took place in a section of the lower tower that Yeon-Woo had selected because he knew its geography well and the people meeting him did not. He had scouted it 2 days prior. He knew where the exits were, which surfaces provided adequate cover, how the space's acoustic properties would affect communication, and where a conflict would naturally move if the meeting went wrong. He arrived early and positioned himself with the patient deliberateness of someone who understood that the geometry of a space was itself a form of leverage. The people who came represented a tier of the clan's operation that was above what the tutorial organizations had shown him, but below the actual decision-making level he was ultimately working toward. They were senior enough to have real information and junior enough to be in the room rather than sending subordinates. He had wanted exactly this tier. They looked at him across the table and ran the same assessment he was running on them. He could see in the quality of their attention that they had prepared. They knew what he had done in the tutorial: the farm takedowns, the Arandan assault, the serpent hunt, the first place finish. They had assembled a profile and they had arrived believing they understood what they were dealing with. He let them present their proposal. He listened to all of it without interrupting. The proposal was, in structural terms, an absorption offer. Join the clan's network at a level commensurate with the skills demonstrated. Receive protection and resources and advancement opportunities in exchange for operating within their framework. It was a good offer by the tower's standards. It was the kind of offer that most people in his demonstrated position would have found difficult to refuse. He told them he would decline. The room's atmosphere changed in the specific way that a room changes when someone has said something that everyone present knows is significant and no one is yet sure how to respond to. He told them why he was declining, and this was the part that was not tactical but was necessary. He was declining because he knew what their organization had done. Not in general terms, specifically. He had names. He had dates. He had a chain of decisions that ran from the tutorial's human farm operations up through the organization's management to people in this room's chain of command. He was not interested in joining the network that had killed his brother. He was interested in taking it apart. He said it in the same flat, calm voice he used for everything. The response was not immediate violence. They were too organized for immediate violence, too aware of the location's uncertainties and their own exposure in an unfamiliar space. What happened instead was a recalibration, a shift from the meeting's presented frame to the reality of what the meeting had actually been, which was not a recruitment conversation, but an assessment. They had come to learn what he was. He had just told them. He also told them something else. He told them that he understood they would now need to report upward. He told them that the people they reported to would need to make a decision about him. He told them that whatever that decision was, it would not change his plans. and he told them that he had found the meeting useful because he now knew several things about their organizational structure that he had only been partially certain of before they walked in. He stood up and left. The walk back to Hanova's section of the tower took him through several corridors he had chosen for their monitoring characteristics. He wanted to know if he was being followed, and he wanted to know it early because the meeting had moved the timeline. He was now visible to the clan's upper management in a way he had not been before. That visibility brought risk. It also brought the possibility of drawing out specific individuals he needed to reach. He was not followed immediately. He was watched. There was a difference, and he could read the difference by the time he reached familiar ground. They had not yet decided to move, which meant the decision was traveling up the chain of command to someone who had the authority to make it. That process would take time. How much time depended on how alarmed they were and how much they understood about what he had told them. Khan was waiting for him when he arrived. He looked at Yeon-Woo's face and read the outcome of the meeting with the accuracy of someone who had been studying Yeon-Woo long enough to map the expressions that most people would read as neutral. He asked if it had gone the way Yeon-Woo planned. Yeon-Woo told him it had gone as expected. He said that things were going to move faster now and that their preparations needed to reflect that. He told Khan what specific resources he needed in the next several days and what intelligence gaps needed to be closed before the clan's response arrived. Khan said that he had already begun acquiring some of what was needed because he had assessed the meeting's likely outcome before Yeon-Woo attended it and had prepared accordingly. Yeon-Woo looked at him for a moment. He said that Khan was turning into a more useful person every day. Khan, who had survived long enough in dangerous places to be fairly difficult to compliment, seemed to find this funnier than most people would have. The Dragon Eyes had been showing him something new for several days, and he had been letting the information accumulate before deciding what to do with it. In the deeper sections of the lower tower, in places where old construction met newer renovation and the tower's architecture showed its age, there were structural anomalies that the eyes flagged as significant. Not traps, not hidden dungeons in the tutorial sense, something different. Spaces that had been deliberately sealed at some point far back in the tower's history, without the kind of marking that would draw attention to them in the present. His brother's records didn't mention most of them, which meant Jung-Woo either hadn't reached them or hadn't possessed the ability to perceive them. The Dragon Eyes were showing him something that hadn't been on anyone's map. He found the first of the sealed spaces on a day when he had arranged to be, by every observable measure, engaged in a completely different part of the tower. He had been careful about this, about understanding who was watching him, when they were watching, and how to create gaps in that observation without announcing that he was creating them. The military background was useful here. The tower's surveillance techniques were sophisticated but not unknowable, and he had spent enough time studying how the clan-connected watchers operated to have a picture of their patterns. The sealed space was behind a section of wall that would have been invisible without the eyes. He opened the entrance mechanism using the same instinctive understanding of hidden structures that the eyes provided. Not a formal understanding, not a process he could have explained in sequential steps, but a direct perception of how the lock was constructed and what it required. It opened in seconds. Inside was not a dungeon and not a cache. It was a record. Someone had been using this space, a very long time ago, to document something. The documentation was not in any current tower language. It was in an older notation system that his brother's records touched on briefly, a format that predated the current clan-controlled tower infrastructure by generations. He could not read it directly. What he could read were the materials used in the documentation, which the Dragon Eyes could analyze for composition and age, and the structural patterns of the notation, which aligned with descriptions in the records of the kind of documentation that had been produced by tower climbers in an era before the 8 great clans had consolidated their control. He did not try to extract or copy the documentation on this visit. He memorized what he could, sealed the space behind him, and left without disturbing the arrangement. What was there would keep. He would need someone who could read the notation, which meant identifying a scholar or historian connected to the pre-clan era's records, who was still alive and accessible in the tower. His brother's records had a name for that category of person, along with a warning. They were rare, and the clans had a history of ensuring that people who could read old documentation were either working for them or not working at all. He added the problem to the list and kept moving. Adora arrived in the lower tower 3 days after his meeting with the clan representatives. He knew she had entered before he saw her, because the network that operated through Khan and Doyle's combined intelligence channels picked up the movement of a high-ranking newcomer from the tutorial who matched her description. He processed the information with the same flat attention he gave everything and waited to see what it developed into. She found him, rather than the reverse. He had not been hiding exactly, but he had not been in the obvious places either, and the fact that she located him within hours of arriving suggested either significant intelligence resources or the predictive ability his brother's records described operating on a practical level rather than just in principle. She was alone when she found him, which was unusual enough that he registered it as significant. Fonte was not with her. She had not brought support. She arrived in the corridor outside Hanova's forge and stopped at a distance that was close enough to communicate intent and far enough to not be confrontational, and she looked at him with an expression that was mostly calm and mostly unreadable and contained. Underneath both of those qualities, something that was neither. He waited. She told him that she had known, when he took first place in the tutorial, that he was something she hadn't accounted for. She said it directly, without apparent difficulty, as if acknowledging a gap in her prediction was not something that cost her much. She said that in her experience, when her ability failed to see something coming, it was because the thing approaching operated outside the patterns she had learned to read, and that in her experience, things that operated outside patterns were either very dangerous or very interesting, and his case appeared to be both. He asked her what she wanted. She said she wasn't entirely sure yet. She said she had come to the lower tower to continue climbing, and that her path and his appeared to be moving in a similar direction through the current floor range. She said that she had spent time in the tutorial watching him from the ranks, and that what she had observed had convinced her that she would learn more from being in proximity to him than from maintaining the competitive distance that the tutorial rankings had enforced. He processed the statement. It was not a recruitment pitch. She was not offering alliance in the terms that the clan representatives had used, not proposing a formal arrangement with stated terms and mutual obligations. She was proposing something less defined, which was in its own way more interesting and considerably more complicated to assess. The predictive ability she possessed was significant. Having it oriented toward him rather than against him was a meaningful variable, but having someone near him who could see angles of a situation he couldn't was also a vulnerability, depending on how her loyalties developed. He told her that he wasn't opposed to proximity and that she should understand the kind of attention he was currently drawing from organizations in this section of the tower, because anyone near him was going to be included in that attention by association. She told him she was already aware. She said that the organizations watching him had already noted her arrival and were running their own assessment of what her presence here meant. She said she had expected that when she decided to come. He looked at her for a long moment. He told her that if she understood the situation and had decided to be here anyway, that was her choice to make. He told her that he didn't make promises about outcomes to people who chose to be near him, because the outcomes weren't his to promise. She said she wasn't asking for promises. She was asking for the chance to see what he was going to do. He moved past her toward the forge without answering, which was, in the particular language of how he communicated, an answer. The response from the clan hierarchy arrived 7 days after the meeting. It did not arrive as a direct approach. It arrived as a shift in the operational environment, a tightening of surveillance, a repositioning of assets in the sections of the tower near Hanova's forge, a quiet withdrawal of the neutral parties who had been conducting ordinary business in those sections. The neutral parties moving out was the most informative signal. People who operated commercially in the tower had strong instincts about when a space was about to become contested, and they moved to non-contested spaces in the same way weather-sensitive creatures move before a storm. He told Hanova on the morning of the 7th day that the window for preparation was closing. Hanova told him he had been told something similar once before, by Yeon-Woo, in the days before the operation that had ultimately cost Yeon-Woo his life. He said it quietly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of the thing that was sitting in the room between them, whether or not it was named. Yeon-Woo met his eyes. He told Hanova that his brother had been alone at the critical moment, that the people around him had used that isolation as a tool. He told him that he was not alone in the same way, and that the people moving against him were doing so with a different understanding of what they were facing than the people who had moved against Yeon-Woo possessed. He told him that what had happened to his brother was not going to happen to him. Hanova looked at him for a long time. He said that Yeon-Woo had been confident too. Yeon-Woo acknowledged the point. He said that confidence and preparation were different qualities, and that what he was relying on was the second one. The first assault element arrived the following morning. It was not a frontal attack. It was a perimeter, a careful positioning of multiple groups that were moving to contain the section of the tower rather than entering it. The goal was to cut off exit routes before applying pressure, which was standard operating procedure for organizations that understood that a capable opponent in open space was much harder to deal with than one that had been pinned in a fixed location. He had anticipated this approach. His brother's records on the relevant clan's operational style had described exactly this preference. He did not wait to be pinned. What followed was not something that could be described in clean sequential terms, because clean sequences belong to engagements where one side is operating with imperfect information and reacting to events. This was not that kind of engagement. He had the layout, he had the timing, estimated within a margin that his experience with the clan's asset positioning had made narrow enough to be useful. He moved before the perimeter finished forming, using the gaps that existed in the incomplete encirclement, the spaces between groups that had not yet linked up, to travel through the contested section in the exact windows those gaps permitted. Adora moved with him. She said nothing about the route he had chosen, but her expression during the movement suggested that she was seeing the logic of it in real time and was not finding it obvious. She kept pace without difficulty. Whatever else she was physically capable at a level that the tutorial rankings had understated. Kian and Doyle had already moved through separately, using different gaps in the perimeter that he had assigned based on assessment of their individual movement styles. Khan's route was the most direct and the most dangerous. He had given it to Khan because Khan was the one of the three of them most capable of converting danger into information while moving through it. Doyle's route was longer and required social navigation in addition to physical, talking his way past 3 separate contact points using cover identities they had established in the days prior. He had given it to Doyle because Doyle was the one best equipped to turn a conversation into a gap in someone's situational awareness. They reassembled at the designated location outside the section. He reviewed what each of them had gathered from their respective passages. The perimeter's formation had given him significant information about the assault team's composition, command structure, and communications pattern. The way units maintained contact with each other revealed which nodes were central to coordination, and the central coordination nodes were the elements that most needed to be addressed when the situation moved from maneuvering to confrontation. Hanova was already at the secondary location they had established. He had moved 2 days prior, quietly, carrying only what was essential to resume work elsewhere, because Yeon-Woo had told him that staying at the forge when the timeline compressed would be exactly the kind of leverage that the clan's people would use. Yeon-Woo looked at the group assembled around him. Khan, Doyle, Adora, and by extension the weight of everything he had built since the watch first played in a cold, quiet room, and went through what came next with the same calm he brought to everything. They were not running. He wanted to be precise about the distinction. What had just happened was not retreat. It was positioning. They had moved out of a static defensive situation into one where they could choose when and where the engagement happened, which was a fundamentally different strategic situation from the one the clan had been trying to create. He told them where they were going next, he told them what they would find there, and he told them that by the time the clan's assault team finished searching the section of tower they had just vacated, the situation would have changed in ways that the people directing that search would not immediately understand. None of them asked him to elaborate. They had spent enough time operating in his proximity to have learned that elaboration came when he decided it was necessary, and that when he said something would happen, it generally did. They moved. The location he had chosen was not random. His brother's records contained a section that most readers, if anyone other than Yeon-Woo had ever read them, would have passed over as peripheral detail. Jung-Woo had documented, with the careful thoroughness that characterized everything he wrote, a network of older tower infrastructure that existed beneath the current floor architecture. Not dungeons in the functional sense, not hidden pieces in the reward sense. Something older than both. The bones of what the tower had been before the 8 great clans had organized themselves into the power structure that currently controlled it. The space they moved into now was part of that older infrastructure. It had taken him 2 visits to map it properly, on the days when he had created gaps in the surveillance and used them for something the Watchers hadn't anticipated. The space was large enough to accommodate the group comfortably, and was structured in a way that gave him what any military mind would recognize as a defensible position. Multiple entry points he controlled the geometry of. an interior that funneled approaching opponents into configurations he could prepare for, and an exit route that the floor's current maps did not show because it had predated those maps by long enough that institutional memory of it had simply lapsed. He had also left things in the space on his previous visits. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have read as significant to anyone who happened to find them without context, but positioned in the right places, the right materials, the right prepared configurations, the right tools to make a response to incoming force, something more than improvised. Khan walked the space once and then looked at him with an expression that combined recognition with something close to professional appreciation. He said that this had been prepared before the meeting with the clan representatives. Yeon-Woo confirmed it. Khan said that meant Yeon-Woo had already expected the meeting to go the way it went before he walked into it. Yeon-Woo told him that he had expected both possible outcomes, acceptance and rejection, and had prepared for the rejection because the rejection was more operationally interesting. If they had accepted the proposal, the situation would have been simpler in some ways and more complicated in others. The rejection had given him what the acceptance couldn't: confirmation of which elements of the clan's organization were directly connected to his brother's case, delivered in the form of who showed up to that meeting and what they said when they thought they were assessing him. Doyle, who had been listening from the room's other end, said that it was mildly unnerving to be allied with someone who ran conversations as intelligence operations. Yeon-Woo did not respond to this, which was a response. Adora had been moving through the space with a different quality of attention than the other two. She was not mapping the defense potential or reviewing operational logic. She was reading something else: the shape of how decisions had been layered into the space's preparation, the thinking visible in the arrangement of what was there and what wasn't. She looked at it the way someone looks at a problem that has been solved elegantly, when they understand the problem well enough to recognize elegance in the solution. She told him that she had thought, when she decided to come to the lower tower, that she would observe him in motion and learn something from the observation. She said she was learning more than she had anticipated. He acknowledged this without comment and moved on to the operational briefing. The clan's response to losing the perimeter would pass through predictable stages. First, assessment of what had happened. The realization that the target had moved before containment was complete, combined with the question of whether this had been luck or preparation. Second, escalation of the search to a wider radius. Third, and most important for his purposes, a communication upward in the chain of command requesting guidance on how to proceed. That communication would have to travel to someone senior enough to authorize a more significant response. He wanted to intercept the communication. Not literally, not technically, but in effect. He wanted to know what decision was made, which meant he needed to know who made it. The identity of the person who received the escalation report and authorized the next action would tell him something about the chain of command that he couldn't confirm from below. Khan asked how he intended to obtain that information. He told Khan that one of the figures from the initial meeting, the quietest one, the one who had been positioned as backup but who the Dragon Eyes had identified as the operationally senior person in the room, had a presence in a specific location in the lower tower that was documented in the records he had gathered from Arendon's base. That figure was not part of the perimeter team. He was a management layer, present for assessment but not for fieldwork, which meant that when the perimeter failed, he would be in his usual location, receiving reports and making decisions. He was going to have a conversation with that person. Doyle asked how voluntary that conversation was going to be. Yeon-Woo told him that would depend on the person. He went alone, not because the others couldn't have come, but because a single figure moving through the lower tower's corridors generated a different pattern of attention than a group, and because what he was going to do required a specific kind of control over the engagement's parameters that was harder to maintain with additional people present. Khan's instinct in a confrontation was direct. Doyle's was adaptive. Adora's was analytical. All of those qualities were useful in the right context and created noise in this one. The figure's location was a private room in one of the lower tower's commercial sections, the kind of accommodation that serious tower climbers maintained in multiple floor ranges so that they always had a secure base of operations within reach. The room's door carried the kind of reinforcement that communicated money and concern for privacy in equal measure. The lock system was sophisticated by the standards of what most people in this section of the tower used. The Dragon Eyes read it in approximately 4 seconds. He was inside without sound. The figure was seated at a desk with documentation spread in front of him and was in the process of writing something when Yeon-Woo entered. He stopped writing at the same moment he registered the presence, and the quality of his stillness in the next second, the absolute cessation of movement, the recalibration happening behind eyes that had gone very flat and very focused, told Yeon-Woo that this was someone with genuine experience in dangerous situations. He was not going to panic, he was going to assess. Yeon-Woo told him to finish his assessment, and then they would talk. The figure looked at him for a long, silent moment. He looked at the door, which was closed behind Yeon-Woo, in a way that communicated the lock had not simply been ignored, but had been opened and reclosed. He looked at what Yeon-Woo was carrying. He looked at his face, which was unmasked in this particular encounter, a choice Yeon-Woo had made deliberately. He asked how Yeon-Woo had gotten in. Yeon-Woo told him that question wasn't the useful one. He said there were useful questions available, and he would prefer they focus on those. The figure's name, from Arendon's records, was Sung-Rok. He was not high enough in the clan's structure to be one of the people Yeon-Woo was ultimately working toward, but he was high enough to have operational knowledge of the section of the clan's activities that connected to the tutorial's human farm network. More specifically, he was high enough to know the name of the person above him who had authorized those activities. Yeon-Woo told him what he knew. He laid it out in the flat, precise way he laid out everything. Dates, names, operational connections, the chain of accountability as he had assembled it from Arendon's documentation and from what the meeting had revealed. He told Sung-Rok that the picture he was drawing was already fairly complete, and that what he was asking for was the one piece he hadn't been able to confirm through other means. Sung-Rok told him that he was describing a situation where sharing that information was not obviously in his interest. Yeon-Woo agreed. He said that the calculations Sung-Rok was running, what the clan would do to him if he shared, versus what Yeon-Woo would do to him if he didn't, was a reasonable one to run, and that he wasn't going to pretend the answer was simple. He said that what he could offer was not safety, because he couldn't guarantee safety for anyone in a situation this complicated, but he could offer something else, the knowledge of what was coming. He told Sung-Rok that the organization he served was going to be dismantled. Not immediately, not in a single engagement, but systematically, piece by piece, in exactly the way that the tutorial's human farm network had been dismantled, from the operational level upward, with each layer's removal creating pressure on the one above it. He told him that the people at the top of that structure were the ones he was interested in. People at Sung-Rok's level were operational damage, useful to address in passing but not the destination. Sung-Rok looked at him with the flat, focused expression of someone running the calculation very carefully. He asked what the guarantee was that Yeon-Woo wouldn't simply eliminate him regardless of what he said. Yeon-Woo told him that there was no guarantee. He said that guarantees in the tower were a form of currency that almost everyone who offered them was counterfeiting, and that he wasn't going to insult Sung-Rok's intelligence by pretending otherwise. He said that what he had instead of a guarantee was a consistent record, which Sung-Rok could verify if he had done his research. In the tutorial, the people who had actively participated in the operations against climbers had been targeted. The operational support people who had been doing their jobs rather than making the policy decisions had been addressed differently. He said that Sung-Rok looked like an operational support person to him. The silence in the room stretched for long enough that Yeon-Woo counted it. Then Sung-Rok told him the name. Yeon-Woo did not write it down. He absorbed it into the same interior architecture where everything else lived, complete, precise, and filed with the other pieces of the structure he had been assembling since the watch first spoke in his dead brother's voice. The name was not the top of the chain, he hadn't expected it to be, but it was the next layer, and the next layer was enough for now. He knew the organizational structure well enough to understand what position that name occupied, and what path from that position led further upward. He thanked Sung-Rok. Not warmly, he was not warm about anything, but with the precise acknowledgement of someone who understood that information had been exchanged and that the exchange had costs on both sides. He left the way he had come in. The dragon body chose the following morning to announce its next stage. He had been aware that it was coming. The signs had been accumulating over the previous week, a pressure in the physical system that was different from fatigue, a quality of heat in his bones that suggested something was reorganizing itself at a level below conscious perception. His brother's records had described the transition in the particular way Yeon-Woo described things he had experienced personally and found difficult to fully articulate, as a restructuring that happened from the inside out, a process that could not be hurried and could not be stopped once it began, and that left the person going through it temporarily in a state of heightened vulnerability that was deeply inconvenient in a contested environment. He had tried to time it. He had arranged the meeting with the clan representatives, the movement through the perimeter, and the conversation with Sung Rok with the awareness that the evolution was approaching and that he needed the operational picture clarified before it arrived. He had managed the timing by about 12 hours. The process took the better part of a day. He spent it in the prepared space in the old infrastructure, with Khan maintaining the perimeter outside and Doyle running interference in the approaches, while his body went through whatever it needed to go through. Adora was there but did not hover. She had correctly read that the transition required neither assistance nor witness, and had positioned herself at a distance that communicated availability without intrusion. What emerged from the process was not dramatically different in appearance from what had gone in. The changes were internal in ways that the dragon eyes showed him when he looked at his own status. The capacity markers were different. The energy architecture was different. The potential ceiling of the current stage had risen past what he had been working within. Functionally, it was like having operated in a room of a certain size and then discovering that the walls had moved. The room was larger. What was possible in it had expanded accordingly. He tested the expansion in the lower tower's dungeon sections over the following 2 days, working through configurations of opponents that had been challenging at the previous stage to establish the new thresholds. The fleeting steps operated differently with the evolved body's speed and energy management behind them. The technique's ceiling had been raised by the physical changes in a way that Galliard's training had established the foundation for without being able to take him all the way to. He understood now that the Dark Elf Master had known this would happen and had structured the training to give him the framework that the evolution would eventually fill in. His brother had written, in one of the record's less structured passages, about what it felt like to understand that his body was becoming something other than what it had been born as. He had described it without drama. Yeon-Woo had been incapable of drama in his writing, which was one of the things that made the record so reliable, as a gradual recognition that the ordinary categories were no longer fitting. Not monstrous, not alien, but different in a way that the old categories couldn't hold. Yeon-Woo read that passage again after the evolution completed. He put the watch away and went back to work. The sealed documentation space called him back on the 4th day after the evolution. He had been running the problem of the old notation system through the background of his thinking since the first visit. How to find someone who could read it, how to approach that person without leading the clan's surveillance directly to the space, how to extract what the documentation contained without either destroying the record or advertising its existence. The answer to the problem arrived through an unexpected vector, Hanova. He had been briefing Hanova on the operational situation during one of the blacksmith's visits to the secondary location, keeping him informed not because Hanova needed to take any specific action, but because Hanova had demonstrated, through his relationship with Yeon-Woo and through his behavior since Yeon-Woo's arrival, that he operated best with real information rather than protective silences. During the briefing, Yeon-Woo had described the sealed space and its contents in enough detail that Hanova's expression had shifted in a way he recognized. He stopped the briefing and asked what Hanova recognized. Hanova told him that what he was describing matched something Yeon-Woo had mentioned, once, in a conversation toward the end of their time working together. Yeon-Woo had found a reference to a scholar in the lower tower, someone who lived and worked outside the clan network, who had spent decades studying pre-clan tower history, and who was, Yeon-Woo had suspected, in possession of reading knowledge of the old notation systems. He had not been able to pursue the contact before the situation with the elixir overtook everything. Yeon-Woo asked for the name and location. The scholar was called Mirvan. He occupied a space in one of the lower tower's quieter sections, not a commercial area, not a dungeon access point, not any of the locations that active climbers had reasons to visit regularly. The kind of area that persisted in the tower's lower floors because it served the administrative and intellectual functions that a structure housing thousands of people required, even in a world organized around combat progression. Libraries existed in the tower. Record rooms existed. People who maintained those things existed too, largely ignored by the climbers who cared only about the floors above. Mirvan received him with the wariness of someone who had learned, through long experience, that unusual visitors to his section of the tower were usually either lost or carrying something complicated. He was not lost. He told Mirvan what he was looking for. Not why, not initially. He described the notation system from what he had observed in the sealed space as accurately as his memory permitted, and watched Mirvan's face while he described it. Mirvan's face told him that he was in the right place. The scholar confirmed that the notation system Yeon-Woo described was from the pre-clan organization period, a documentation format that had been used by independent tower researchers before the 8 clans had formalized the tower's governance, and made independent research of that kind systematically difficult to continue. He confirmed that he could read it. He confirmed it in the tone of someone who had not been asked to read it in a very long time, and who found the prospect of being asked now both interesting and slightly alarming. Yeon-Woo told him why he wanted to access the documentation. He laid out a version of the story that was complete in its essential facts and selective in the details that would have created risks for Mirvan by knowing them. He told him about Jung-Woo. He told him what he believed the sealed space contained based on partial observation. He told him that reading the documentation might provide information about the early history of specific operations that had been running in the tower for long enough that their current form had been preceded by something the clan-era records had obscured. Mirvan listened to all of it. He said that what Yeon-Woo was describing had implications that went beyond one man's revenge for one man's death, which was not a criticism, just an observation. He said that documentation from that period, if it contained what Yeon-Woo suspected, was the kind of material that the clans had been systematically ensuring didn't survive. He asked how Yeon-Woo had found the sealed space. Yeon-Woo told him about the dragon eyes. Mirvan looked at him with an expression that rearranged itself across several phases, before settling into something that resembled the specific kind of calm that people adopt when they have just received information that is going to change how they think about a situation. He asked if Yeon-Woo knew what the dragon eyes indicated about the person carrying them. Yeon-Woo told him what he knew from his brother's records, the evolution path, the dragon body stages, the trajectory the ability pointed toward. Mirvan told him that the records he was describing were incomplete. Not wrong, his brother had documented what he had observed. But the pre-clan documentation, if it was what Mirvan suspected from Yeon-Woo's description, contained information about the dragon body's history in the tower that post-clan records had systematically excluded. He said that if he read the sealed documentation and it confirmed his suspicion, then what Yeon-Woo was becoming was something that certain clan power structures had very specific reasons to want to prevent from fully developing. He said it carefully, without apparent agenda, just a man sharing information he considered relevant. Yeon-Woo filed the implication and agreed to take Mirvan to the sealed space. The translation took 2 days. Mirvan worked in the kind of focused silence that serious scholars develop, present in the space, moving through the documentation with the methodical attention of someone for whom the content was mattering more than he had initially expected, recording his reading in a notation system Yeon-Woo could follow. He did not editorialize while he worked. He translated, and Yeon-Woo read what was translated, and what was in the documentation proved to be exactly the kind of thing the clans had wanted not to survive. The organization of the tower's lower infrastructure, in the period before the 8 clans had consolidated control, had been structured around a different principle than combat progression. The earlier framework had been built around something the documentation called completion, a concept that described a form of tower traversal that wasn't about climbing floors competitively, but about understanding what the tower actually was and what it had been built to do. The dragon body, in that earlier framework, was not a combat evolution, but a key, a specific form of development that, when taken far enough, unlocked access to parts of the tower that the current clan-controlled structure had effectively sealed off. The clans had sealed them off deliberately. The documentation made this explicit, in the slightly formal language of a record written by people who understood they might be among the last to document what they were documenting. They had sealed off the completion paths because the completion paths led to knowledge and access that would have made the clan hierarchy's control of the tower structurally impossible to maintain. People who followed the completion path all the way to its end did not need what the clans offered, and people who didn't need what the clans offered were, from the clan's perspective, a category of person that should not be permitted to exist in significant numbers. Yeon-Woo sat with the translated documentation for a long time after Mirvan finished. His brother had not known this. Jung-Woo's records described the dragon body purely in terms of what it did in the context of the combat progression that the current tower framework emphasized. He had been developing something he thought was a combat evolution, A dramatically powerful one, yes, but a combat evolution in the framework he had been handed. He had not known what the clans knew about what the dragon body actually pointed toward. The people who had killed his brother had known. Or at least, some of them had. The elixir his brother had obtained, the thing that had started the chain of events that ended with Yeon-Woo's death, was connected to the completion framework in a way that the records now made legible. It had not been just a powerful artifact in the combat progression sense. It had been a piece of the older system, something that retained, in its construction, information about the sealed paths. The clans had wanted it destroyed. Yeon-Woo, who hadn't fully understood what he had simply not wanted it stolen. The murder had been two things simultaneously, a theft and a silencing. They had taken the elixir and ensured that the person who had found it would not be around to figure out what he had actually found. He stood up from the documentation and looked at the wall of the sealed space for a moment. Then he thanked Mirvan in the precise way he thanked people, and told him that he would ensure the documentation remained intact, and that Mirvan's knowledge of its location would remain between the two of them. He told him that if circumstances changed, and the documentation became relevant in a wider context, he would find him again. Mirvan told him that he hoped circumstances did change in that way. He said it with the quiet emphasis of someone who had spent decades in the tower's margins, maintaining knowledge that powerful people preferred not to exist, and who understood that the continuation of that knowledge depended on the existence of people willing to do something about the power structures that suppressed it. Yeon-Woo returned to the group with what he had found. He briefed Khan first, then Doyle, then Adora. He gave them the operational facts and let the implications sit without editorial. The dragon body's real nature, the sealed paths, the clans' history of suppressing the completion framework, the way his brother's murder connected to a system of control that went deeper than the ordinary tower politics that most climbers understood as the whole story. Khan absorbed it in silence and then said that the scale of what they were apparently in the middle of was somewhat larger than he had initially understood. Yeon-Woo told him that the scale of what they were going after was, yes, larger than the tutorial had suggested. Khan considered this. He said that this was something he would have appreciated knowing before he formed an alliance based on revenge for one man's death, and that he was now sitting with the information that the thing he had allied himself to was potentially a structural confrontation with the tower's dominant power framework. He asked if Yeon-Woo had known this at the start. Yeon-Woo told him honestly that he had not known the full picture. He told him that what he had known was the part about his brother, and that the rest had revealed itself as he moved through it, and that if Khan wanted to recalibrate his involvement based on the updated picture, that was a decision Khan had the right to make. Khan was quiet for a long time. He said that he was going to need significantly better equipment. Doyle laughed. It was the kind of laugh that appears when tension has been held too long and finds an unexpected exit, and it was genuine in the way Doyle's reactions were almost always genuine. He said that he had followed stranger people into worse situations on less information. Adora said nothing. She was looking at Yeon-Woo with an expression that had moved past the careful analytical calm she usually maintained into something that operated underneath it. She had come to the lower tower saying she wanted to observe what he was going to do. She had, perhaps, gotten more of an answer to that question than she had anticipated. He looked at all three of them. He told them that what came next was a direct approach to the name Sungrock had given him. Not immediately. The operational preparation required time, and the new understanding of the clan's motivations had shifted the strategic picture in ways he needed to process fully before acting. But soon, he told them that what came next was a confrontation with someone who had authorized operations that led directly to his brother's death, and that the confrontation would not be a meeting, and it would not be a negotiation. He told them that they were, if they chose to be, welcome to be present. Nobody left. He went back to the watch that night. He had not listened to the recordings in some time, had not needed to, because so much of what they contained was already fully integrated into how he understood the tower and how he moved through it. But he had a habit, since the beginning, of returning to them when something significant had shifted. Not for tactical information, for something else that he did not often name. His brother's voice in the recording was the same as it always had been, careful, precise, with the particular warmth that Yeon-Woo had carried even in documentation that was essentially a message to someone who might come after him. He had spoken as if Yeon-Woo would hear it. He had always spoken as if Yeon-Woo would hear it. From the very first recording to the last, as if the possibility that no one would come was something he hadn't been willing to entertain. There was a passage near the end that Yeon-Woo had returned to more than any other. His brother, in the final days before the recording stopped, had described a moment of sitting somewhere in the tower and understanding that the thing he was building, the path he was on, the potential he was developing, was too important to disappear with him if something went wrong. He described the decision to begin documenting everything. He said that he was leaving it for the person he trusted most in the world, and that even if that person never entered the tower, even if he lived a long, ordinary life somewhere that didn't involve any of this, the act of leaving the record meant that the work had not simply ended with him. He had said that it was enough. That even if no one came, the record existing was enough. Yeon-Woo closed the watch and sat in the quiet of the old infrastructure space for a moment. Then he picked up the weapon Hanova had made for him, checked the configuration of everything he was carrying, and began preparing for what came next. The clan lieutenant whose name Sung-Rok had given him occupied a floor above the section Yeon-Woo was currently operating in. Not far above, within range of where a climber at his registered level could legitimately travel, just above the threshold that most lower tower inhabitants treated as the ceiling of their operational range. The gap between where he was and where this person sat was not enormous in absolute terms. What made it significant was the institutional support that surrounded that position, the protective layers that a mid-level clan manager accumulated over time, the guards, the allies, the early warning systems, the reputation that functioned as its own form of deterrence. He spent 3 days assembling the picture, the movement pattern, the support structure, the security arrangements, the moments when the layers were thinner. He did not rush. His brother had been rushed, had been operating against time pressure that the people hunting him had deliberately created, and the rush had contributed to the conditions that ended his life. Yeon-Woo was not going to be rushed. He was going to be ready. On the morning of the 4th day, he told Khan and Doyle where he was going and when, and told them what role he needed them to play. Not in the primary engagement, but in the approach, in the way that would allow him to reach the engagement without the support structure being alerted in the minutes before he arrived. He told Adora that she could come if she understood she was an observer. She accepted the condition. He moved through the threshold between floors in the late afternoon, when the traffic in that section was at its most varied, and a new figure moving upward drew the least concentrated attention. The dragon eyes worked continuously during the approach, reading the space ahead, mapping the energy signatures of individuals around him, identifying the security architecture without making it obvious that he was identifying it. The lieutenant's name was Chae Hak-soo. He was present, as the pattern suggested he would be. He was in the company of 2 other people when Yeon-Woo found him. Not guards in the formal sense, but capable fighters in the ambient sense. The kind of accompaniment that senior clan personnel maintained in the way that some people carry tools. Useful when needed, not explicitly threatening when not. They were not expecting a specific threat. They were providing general coverage. He went through them efficiently, not lethally, for either of them. They were operational, not policy, and the distinction he had described to Sung-Rok was one he applied consistently. They were not part of the list. They were on the wrong side of a situation they had probably not fully understood when they took the assignment, and removing them from the situation was sufficient without making it permanent. Chae Hak-soo watched this happen and had the quality of stillness that Sung-Rok had possessed. The experienced person's recognition that panic was counterproductive and that assessment was the correct response. He looked at Yeon-Woo and ran the calculation. Yeon-Woo told him his name, his real name, not the alias from the tutorial, not the masked figure that the clan's intelligence operation had been trying to understand. Cha Yeon-Woo, twin brother of Cha Jung-woo. He watched the name land. He watched Chae Hak-soo's face process the name and what it meant, the implication of who was standing in front of him and why, the connection between the dead climber that had been a small operational matter years ago and the figure who had been dismantling the organization's tutorial infrastructure and was now standing in a room above the floor he should have been able to reach. He asked Chae Hak-soo to tell him about the last weeks of his brother's life. The conversation that followed was the longest he had conducted since entering the tower. Not because Chae Hak-soo was cooperative, he was not, initially, fully cooperative, and the process of moving him from resistance to account took time and required the application of specific pressures at specific points. But what came out of it over the course of that time was more complete than anything the records or the farm documentation or Sung-Rok had given him. He learned who had given the specific authorization. The name sat one level above Chae Hak-soo in the chain. a figure within the 8-clan hierarchy proper. Not the highest level, but close enough to it to have real power and to have made the decision that Yeon-Woo needed to not survive what he had found. He learned what had actually happened in the final hours. His brother's records had contained the emotional account, the betrayal, the moment of understanding, the decision to start the watch rather than fight back. What Chae Hak-soo provided was the operational account. Who had been positioned where, who had given the signal, what had been done after to ensure the record was clean. It was not comfortable information. He received it the way he received all information, directly, without flinching, filing it into the architecture of what he knew. He learned what had been done with the elixir after it was taken. This was the piece that connected what Mirvan's translation had revealed to the operational reality of where things stood now. The elixir had not been destroyed. It had been secured within the clan's holdings at a level high enough that it had been inaccessible to the middle management tiers who had arranged the theft. Someone near the top of the chain had wanted it intact and had kept it that way, which meant it was still there. He sat with that information for a moment before he stood up. He told Chae Hak-soo that he was done. He said it without additional elaboration and left the room, rejoining Adora in the corridor outside with the particular quality of silence that she had learned, in the weeks since her arrival in the lower tower, to recognize as him processing something significant. She did not ask immediately. He told her on the walk back down through the floor threshold, in the measured way he told things when he had decided they were worth saying. He told her what he had learned, the name of the person who had authorized his brother's murder, the location of the elixir, the shape of the path between where he currently was and where he needed to go to reach both. She walked beside him through the lower tower's corridors and did not say anything for a long time. Then she told him that her predictive ability had been struggling with him since the moment they met. She said that most people, when she looked at them, resolved into a set of possible paths, futures that her ability could map with varying degrees of certainty, outcomes she could see approaching before they arrived. She said that when she looked at him, the paths did not resolve in the normal way. They converged instead on a single point that she could see clearly but could not see past. He asked her what the point looked like. She told him it looked like the top of something very high, and like a reckoning. He considered this. He told her that he had no particular opinion about the top of the tower, that he had not entered it with the intention of reaching the highest floor or becoming the strongest climber. He had entered it to find the people responsible for his brother's death and to ensure that what had been taken from his brother and from everyone in those human farms was answered for. He told her that the top of the tower was where the people who had made those decisions lived. She absorbed that. He told her that if her ability was showing her a convergence in his future, she should understand what that convergence was built on, not ambition, not the progression fantasy that drove most climbers upward, something simpler and considerably less negotiable. They walked the rest of the way in silence. The name he now carried, the person who had authorized Yeon-Woo's murder, who was holding the elixir somewhere in the clan hierarchy's upper holdings, who sat in a position of genuine power above the floors he had yet to climb, was the next entry on a list that had been getting shorter since the moment a watch activated in a cold room. The list was not empty. Not yet, but it was shorter, and the gap between where he was and where he needed to be was, for the first time since he entered the tower, something he could measure. He returned to Hanova's secondary location in the last light of the day, sat down with the watch in the quiet before the others returned, and let his brother's voice play once more in the silence. Yeon-Woo had said near the end of the recordings that he was sorry, not for finding the tower, not for what he had tried to build inside it, but for leaving before the story was finished. He had said it in the careful way he said everything, with the precision of someone who understood the weight of words and did not use them carelessly. He said that he had been trying to build something that could not be stopped, and that if it was stopped anyway, then the most he could hope for was that someone would pick it up from where he had left it. He had said that he knew, if anyone came, it would be his brother. Yeon-Woo closed the watch and sat in the silence. Somewhere above him, multiple floors up, in the part of the tower where real power resided and real decisions were made, a man was holding something that had cost his brother his life. He was not going to stop until that changed.